Hello, I'm Dr. Stanley Sandler, and recently I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about Vichy France, and one of the point it was making that a lot of Americans, not just Americans, Englishmen and Frenchmen and so on, well, Frenchmen do, but most of the Western world doesn't know what Vichy France was, and so I just want to talk about that. It's a very also an anomaly in World War II. Vichy France began with the French defeat by the Germans. They signed a surrender on June 22nd, I believe, 1940. The Germans had run over France and completely defeated it in 6 weeks. But I should point out here, though, that 90 to 100,000 Frenchmen died in that campaign. All the French, they ran away, no. And not only that, but they also, the Italians, jackal like, tried to invade France from the south. And the French stopped them cold. I think they got like 1 mile inside French territory. And here is France collapsing, falling apart, supposedly everybody running away. And they stopped the Italians. Well, maybe that's such a big deal. But anyway, they stopped them. Mussolini's dreams of empire. But the point I want to talk about here is Vichy France. Germany did not conquer all of France. They kind of got smart here. But first, I should say, when the armistice agreement was signed, it wasn't a peace treaty between France and Nazi Germany. It was an armistice. And so they are officially still in the state of war. And that armistice was signed in General Foch, Ferdinand Foch. He was the Allied leader in World War One, and he had this railway car in which he had the German emissaries in World War One sign the armistice ending World War One. That again wasn't a peace treaty yet. So the Germans said, that's what we want, and they ordered that railway car to be brought from a museum in Paris and brought back to the very spot where the armistice had been signed. And then the French delegation had to come and sign the armistice agreement with Germany. It must have been a humiliating experience. And Admiral Foch's railway car was considered the great scene of the triumph of World War One, and now they had to sign their treaty of peace and then or of non-warfare. And one of their generals said afterwards, they had what were the armistice terms like? And he said, they're hard but bearable. All right. So the main thing that certainly had to do with Vichy France is that Germany did not take all of France. They kind of got smart here. They figured, France is a populous country, kind of big and industrialized. We don't want to have all our troops here just guarding everything they do. So what they did was they took the northern part of France. So that was the occupied zone. And that was, of course, right next to the English Channel. And so they're getting ready to invade England at this time. And of course, most of England's finished anyway. First France and now, first Poland, then France, then Belgium, and everybody. But so they left the southern part of France unoccupied. It was ruled under this is where the word Vichy France comes from. A relatively small vacation town, but had a lot of hotels in it. So I figured that'd be an ideal spot to have a government. And so this is a French government, which had pretty much can do their internal affairs on their own. Now they couldn't just go against the Germans and anything, but just every day, delivering the mail and that sort of thing, they could do that. And it was under the head of their Marshal Pétain. Now Pétain was the head of French forces fighting the Battle of Verdun, and his famous statement, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, and they didn't. Of course, about 1 million people died, both sides together, but still they didn't pass. So the French trotted him out. He was about 80-some years old at this time, and he became the head of state of Vichy, which you call like a semi-state, a semi-government. Matter of fact, all other countries of any importance had embassies there. In fact, the United States had an embassy to Vichy France, and so did Great Britain. Okay, because Vichy France was out of the war now. Okay, the peace treaty hadn't been signed, but the fighting had stopped. And what Pétain and what Vichy France did, they kind of the idea, and many Frenchmen shared this idea, we've become decadent and soft, just exactly what the Nazis is saying about the French. Like the French weren't subhumans or anything, but Untermenschen, but they were kind of decadent, and they drank too much, that sort of stereotype. And so Marshal Pétain went along with that. He was very conservative. He said, what we need is more discipline. not rights to votes and that civil rights, anything like that. It's just just it should be discipline. And the instead of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which had been in all French coins, I guess, since the Revolution, it was work, family, country. Okay, that you work for the country and the family. They were very strong on family values. So that's how Vichy France got started and set up. And Germany had its ambassador in Vichy France. Vichy France had its ambassador in Germany. So it's sort of like a quasi or a half state. But Roosevelt actually sent Admiral Leahy, um, his aide, to Vichy France to represent American interests. Of course, we weren't in the war yet, so. Um, but even after we got in the war, after Pearl Harbor, we still had an ambassador in Vichy France. So they kind of got the country together. We're going to work harder. We're going to be really hard. All the conservative values. I don't say that in a pejorative or beneficial sense. That's just what they were. That work, family, country. But as time went on, the Germans began to say, well, you've got a lot of Jews down here in Vichy France, and you got to round them up. And so the darkest stain on Vichy France's historical record was they rounded up the Jews and they delivered them to the Nazis, and most of those Jews went to Auschwitz and in Eastern Europe, in Poland. That was the darkest thing in Vichy history. Now, Pétain was the president of France. The actual prime minister who does the work in a parliamentary system was a rather sinister character called Pierre Laval. And Laval, before the war, he was a radical socialist, which in France meant, well, kind of a middle-class party, middle-of-the-road party. But he really almost enthusiastically followed the Germans. Now, you might say, oh, the Germans, I mean, who wants to? At that time in France, they figured Germany's going to win the war. I mean, after all, the British had been kicked out at Dunkirk, and their own army, which was supposed to be the best army in the world, okay? In fact, Churchill himself said before the war, thank God for the French army. So they were stunned that our army had been defeated by the Germans, and the Germans had already defeated Poland and gone through Belgium and Norway and Holland. So it's a very strong bet that the Germans are going to win this war. As a matter of fact, our ambassador to Britain, Joseph Kennedy, the father of J.F. Kennedy and the other Kennedys, he said England's finished. Democracy is finished, not just England. Democracy is finished. That's it. We've had it. Oh, and so what we have to do is stay back in the States and really build up, our defense thing, but not get involved in all this sort of thing. And global responsibilities, or at least responsibilities in Europe. And he was certainly thoroughly convinced. Well, he was a pessimist in everything, but a very low view of human nature. They don't want to get anything right. But so he was, he was an example of the Charles Lindbergh, the lone eagle. He also said that Germany's going to win this war. Lindbergh, I think one of the things I have against him is that he should have known better. He went to Germany before the war and he said, oh, about 1938, 39, German aircraft industry is twice as big as the British and French combined, and their airplanes are much better than ours. I guess he'd never heard of the Spitfire or the Hurricane, okay? But anyway, he also said we shouldn't get involved in this. And the Jews are kind of trying to get us into this thing also. So anyway, so Vichy France begins to increasingly collaborate with the Germans, and particularly in rounding up the Jews, and not just Jews, of course. The Nazis were also, against the homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses for some reason, gypsies, whatever. All these people they didn't like. The Vichy the Vichy French did what they wanted them to do. And now, after the United States got in the war, I said we still had relations with France, but those broke when we invaded North Africa in November of 1942. We couldn't quite, liberate France or anything. Well, let's go to French North Africa and clear that out, and that would make sure that the Mediterranean would still be safe for Allied shipping. And so we landed in Algeria and Morocco, and that is when the Germans said, okay, no more of Vichy, and they invaded Vichy. And actually, the Vichy French, see, they inherited the French Empire in North Africa. And as we landed in North Africa, we and the British, the Vichy French fought back. Yeah, and, a fair number of Americans were killed in fighting against the French. We were fighting the French in World War II, in the early part of World War II. And that is when the Germans said, okay, we're going to move in here now and take over. And they moved in, and that was the end of well, not quite the end. Actually, it has sort of a shadowy still existence. These guys like Pétain and Laval wanted to stay in power, and they still did, except they were more subservient. And now there were German occupation forces in France. In fact, the French had their own. Well, they had two. They had their military, which they're allowed to keep, reduced in size, but they also had the milice, which did the internal work of the Vichy French, and that is round up Jews and other non-desirables, and also to fight the resistance, the resistance, which was springing up in France as the German screw and the boot really got tighter and tighter. And so they stayed in power, but we've eventually cleared out Vichy France, the Vichy forces from France itself. We signed an armistice. But the one thing that Vichy people did do, you have to give them credit for it. They said, as they were collapsing or ready to sign the agreement with the armistice with the Germans, they told the British, "We will not allow our navy to be used against you guys, the British." And this was serious because the French had a very good navy. One of the leaders of the right wing in France, which really was strongly Vichy, was Marshal Darlan. He really rebuilt the French navy and some very good battleships, for example. And the British had they had some of these battleships in French North in the ports in North Africa, and the British said, "You've got to, at least disarm these ships or do something with them. You can't just have them there." And the French said, "No, this is our battleships. You can't just attack us." But the British did, and they heavy loss of life. They sank one battleship and disabled another one. So by that time, the very bad feelings between the French and even the non-Vichy French and the British. But we did, I said, did clear North Africa out, and Vichy France was increasingly under the jackboot of the Nazis. And of course, after the landing in France, the days of Vichy were seen to be increasingly numbered, but they stayed in power. They were evacuated by the leaders were evacuated by the Germans to Germany. And after the war, after the treaty was not treaty, but the ceasefire was signed with the Germans, they surrendered to the Allies. And now this is what the French really viciously returned, made the Vichy people pay for what they had done, because as it looked like Germany was losing the war, then support for Vichy really started to plummet. And after the war, Pétain and Darlan and other collaborationists that were put on trial, and Marshal Pétain was, and both Pétain and the prime minister were condemned to death, and because of his service in World War I, Marshal Pétain was put on an island fortress, and he had to stay there. And Pierre Laval was condemned to death. Both trials were really no great monument to French jurisprudence. I mean, it was just more or less a lynch mob, and you all are going to pay for this. And it wasn't long before Pétain, Laval, was frog marched out to the nearest shooting range and was shot. And there was a lot of that sort of thing going on in France after the war, a shooting of collaborationists, people. But what was collaborationism? I mean, you're driving a train, let's say you're a locomotive engineer, and you're hauling a train full of German troops. Does that make you a collaborationist? I mean, you got a family, you got to support them. Maybe a trainload of Jews headed for Auschwitz. You're a part of that, or all kind of you deliver mail. So a lot of, and also you find a lot of people who were kind of semi-collaborators, all of a sudden became resistance fighters. Oh yes, we're right out there in the Maquis, the bush, fighting the Germans. So it's hard, how many records were kept of that? Who's a collaborationist and who isn't? But there really was a strong anti-resistance force. I mean, they had their own newspapers and arms depots and that type of thing. The Poles and the French certainly had the most extensive uh, underground against the Germans in World War II. So Vichy's the sort of thing that the French don't like to talk about because it was a collaborationist thing about almost unbelievable. So the Germans were saying, like, the Vichy's, it's sovereign entity here. And what they did, being Germans, they would send spies into Vichy. And so they would, the French underground, the French intelligence services, Vichy or not, were very good. And it wasn't long before the Sûreté, the intelligence service, would catch on to these, not all of them, but a number of these German spies in France, and they had them shot. And the Germans, they said, "Oh, you can't do it." They said, "Well, that's the laws of war. If you catch a spy in your territory in wartime, it needs to be shot." So when I read that, I really had to read that twice to make sure I got it right. But it is a period of shame in France. First, catastrophic loss to Germany, which nobody anticipated. Okay. I mean, they're fighting. The Allies were fighting World War I all over again, and they got. And then, of course, the British were kicked out too. And then the shock. I think it was the shock more than anything else that the French had. It was a while before any resistance would spring up. The communists were the first. You see, at this time, up until June of 1941, the communists and Nazis were in a non-aggression pact, the Hitler-Stalin pact, and a number of communists and so on who were they picked up by the Germans or picked up by the French in Vichy France were turned over to the Germans and shot. So they it's not a sort of you can argue very much so the French had collaborated too much with the Germans. But I say they were in a state of shock, and they just and Pétain was a figure like definitely a father figure. Everybody's calling him a father figure. He's an old man, and he's now the head. In fact, he said when he made his first broadcast to the French people after the war, the battle for France is over, and we've got to settle down and collaborate. He said, "I mean, donnez ma personne. I'm giving you my person." Then you could argue the guy had a lot of conceit in him, but he was giving his person to the French nation in this hour of trial and need, and they should rally around him. Rally to me, Frenchmen, because I will protect you from the bad things that we're in. And now, with the invasion of Russia by the Germans, much to Stalin's surprise, he was bending. Oh, you're talking about unprovoked aggression. That's certainly. I mean, maybe Stalin was asking for it, but or deserved it. But he was bending over backwards not to provoke the Germans. The Germans were flying reconnaissance flights over Russia and that sort of thing before the invasion. And as a matter of fact, a number of spies were telling Stalin, look, and Churchill warned Stalin, look, the Germans are coming. And he said, you're trying to provoke. And some of those spies were actually shot. So that's the other thing about Vichy France, very anti-communist, because that, to collaborate with the Germans, you had to be Nazis, you had to be, even in the period of the Hitler-Stalin pact, you had to be anti-communist. And so that was one of the appeals of the Nazis. Well, they're anti-communist, okay? So maybe you may not like the Nazis that much, but they're asking for it. I mean, there were people in Britain who were willing to collaborate also. They feeling that, the Nazis aren't the sort of chaps you'd invite over for a weekend, and fox hunting and so on. But they're anti-communists at least, so they probably would have done a deal with the Germans. I mean, the leaders of the appeasement movement before the war, of course, Chamberlain and Lord Halifax, many rather strongly right-wing conservatives probably would have said, better Hitler than Stalin. All right. I mean, they didn't know the full horror of Nazism, but they know it was pretty bad. But they were willing to do that. And so that's the background to Vichy France and why they were what they were. And I say it's a very sore spot for the French to this day. Most of them feel, I was in the resistance. I had nothing to do with Vichy France. Well, thank you for watching and listening. Dr. Sandler saying goodbye for now. I hope to talk to you again. Bye-bye.